The mysterious collapse of World Trade Center 7. Why the final official report about 9/11 is unscientific and false. By David Ray Griffin. Narrated by Mike Cinko. Introduction. The background to NIST's WTC-7 report. There are two main theories as to who was responsible for the 9/11 attacks. According to the theory put forth by the Bush-Cheney administration, and it is merely a theory because no proof has ever been provided, the attacks were planned and carried out solely by al-Qaeda terrorists under the authorization of Osama bin Laden. The alternative theory, espoused by members of what has come to be known as the 9/11 Truth Movement, holds that the attacks were orchestrated by officials of the Bush-Cheney administration itself. According to members of the 9/11 Truth Movement, the attacks were a false flag operation in which evidence is planted to implicate the groups or countries the actual perpetrators wish to attack. In this particular case, the Bush-Cheney administration had already decided months before 9/11 to attack Muslim countries in the Middle East, most immediately Afghanistan and Iraq. In planning and carrying out the 9/11 attacks, the perpetrators planted evidence to implicate Middle Eastern Muslims, evidence that, when examined, can easily be seen to have been fabricated. The 9/11 Truth Movement holds that, when the official count of the attacks is subject to critical scrutiny, it can be shown to be false. Many members in the movement believe this falsity to be most obvious in relation to the collapse of Building 7 of the World Trade Center, usually called WTC-7. This collapse is, accordingly, often referred to as the official account's Achilles heel or smoking gun. WTC-7, the official account's Achilles heel and central mystery. According to the official account of 9/11, the Twin Towers, WTC-1 and 2, came down because of the impacts of the airplanes and the ensuing jet fuel fires. Even if that account makes no sense to increasing numbers of scientists, architects, and engineers, it has had enough apparent plausibility to be convincing to a majority of the U.S. population. But WTC-7 also collapsed that day, and it was not hit by a plane. It seemed, therefore, that it had been brought down by a fire alone, a fact that would have made its collapse an unprecedented occurrence. As New York Times writer James Glanz wrote a couple of months after 9/11, experts said no building like it, a modern steel-reinforced high-rise, had ever collapsed because of an uncontrollable fire. Glanz also quoted a structural engineer as saying, "Within the structural engineering community, WTC-7 is considered to be much more important to understand than the Twin Towers, because engineers had no answer to the question, why did 7 come down?" This question did, to be sure, have a possible answer. That WTC-7 was brought down with pre-placed explosives in the procedure known as controlled demolition. This is the only way in which steel-framed, high-rise buildings had previously been caused to collapse. From a purely scientific perspective, therefore, the most likely explanation for the collapse of WTC-7 would have been that it, too, had been brought down by explosives. Public discussion of the destruction of the World Trade Center, however, occurred in a political, not a scientific context. America had just been attacked, and it was almost universally believed by foreign terrorists who had hijacked planes and flown them into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. Publicly interpreting this as an act of war, the Bush administration had launched a war on terror, purportedly in response to the attacks. Because the idea that one of the WTC buildings had been brought down by explosives would have implied that the attacks were not a surprise. This idea, could not be entertained by many minds in private, let alone in public. Even less could it be suggested in the mass media, at least after the day of 9/11 itself, on which a few reporters did suggest that the buildings had been brought down with explosives. And so the collapse of WTC-7 was classified as a mystery, to the extent that it entered into the public consciousness at all. But this was not much. Although WTC-7 was a 47-story building, and hence in most places would have been the tallest building in the city or even the state, it was dwarfed by the 110-story Twin Towers. It was also dwarfed by them in the ensuing media coverage. And so, James Glanz wrote, the collapse of WTC-7 was a mystery that would probably have captured the attention of the city and the world if the Twin Towers had not also come down. As it was, however, there was little discussion of this mystery. Indeed, it almost seemed as if the authorities did not want the public to think about WTC-7. Although television viewers repeatedly saw the Twin Towers being hit by planes and then coming down, footage of the collapse of WTC-7 was seldom, if ever, seen on mainstream television after 9/11 itself. And when the 9/11 Commission report appeared in 2004, it did not, amazingly enough, even mention the fact that this third building had collapsed. Although the 9/11 Truth Movement, in response, increased its effort to publicize the collapse of WTC-7, a Zogby poll in May 2006 found that 43% of the American people were still unaware that WTC-7 had collapsed. If the authorities did deliberately try to keep the public from thinking about WTC-7 by focusing its attention on the Twin Towers, there would have been a good reason for this. Besides the fact that WTC-7 had not been hit by a plane and did not have large fires spread by jet fuel, its collapse, as seen on videos, looks, compared with that of the Twin Towers, much more like the kind of controlled demolition known as implosion, in which the collapse starts from the bottom and then the building comes down into its own footprint, ending up as a rather compact pile of debris. The videos also show that WTC-7 came down in virtual freefall, which would normally be possible only if all of its support columns had been removed by explosives. Accordingly, when people who knew something about these matters see a video of the collapse of WTC-7, they almost immediately conclude that it must have been brought down by explosives. For example, Daniel Hoffnung, an engineer in Paris, wrote, "In the years after the 9/11 events, I thought that all I read in professional reviews and French newspapers was true. The first time I understood that it was impossible was when I saw a film about the collapse of WTC-7. Likewise, Chester Gerhardt, who before his retirement was a civil engineer for Kansas City, Missouri, said, "I have watched the construction of many large buildings and also have personally witnessed 5 controlled demolitions in Kansas City. When I saw the towers fall on 9/11, I knew something was wrong, and my first instinct was that it was impossible. When I saw Building 7 fall, I knew it was a CD, controlled demolition."